Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to class. And you know that we're going to continue with the lecture that we were doing in the previous class, the essay that Charles Lamb has titled The Praise of Chimney Sweepers. How many of you remember where we left off? Not as many as I expected. So let me just quickly recap what we were doing in the last lecture, and then we'll go on with the lecture that we have reserved for today. The essay is titled The Praise of Chimney Sweepers, and in this essay Lamb is discussing a class of people who have not just been ignored or avoided, but you do not find any mention of them as being or living at the same time as the aristocracy. Lamb, you know, was writing in the 18th century, and he was writing at a time when the excesses of the aristocracy had reached their peak. And Lamb, Dickens, they are writing about what interests common man. He's writing of not just what is of interest to the educated and the aristocratic class, but also what would be of interest to posterity as to conditions that existed in the 18th century. So in this essay that he has titled The Praise of Chimney Sweepers, he asks us to look very closely at a class of people, and in this class what is noteworthy is that you have very young boys comprising a major section of this class of society. And these are young boys who appear to be very poor because they're doing work that is ill-paid, they're doing work that is hard, they're doing work that is dirty. So in the very literal sense of the word, they're doing the dirty work. They're going inside chimneys and they're cleaning the chimneys. They're chimney sweepers, they're chimney cleaners. And Lamb is discussing the chimney sweepers who are not, let's say, yet professionals, and they belong to the age group where perhaps in a different setup they would be going to school or they would be pampered. But these are young boys that rise with dawn, and at a time when perhaps the young men of the aristocratic class are returning from parties, these young boys are already on their way to work. And Lamb, in the guise of Ilya, goes on to describe what specific features this class of young boys possesses. And one of the things that he points to is their fondness for sassafras tea. Although Ilya admits that sassafras tea is something that he cannot bear, yet he says that he's aware that there are other people who like it, and in particular these young boys who work as chimney sweepers, they seem to have a particular affinity for this brew, for this tea that is made out of a kind of wood and to which milk and sugar are added. So this is something that chimney sweepers like particularly. And he goes on to discuss various other aspects of chimney sweepers, particularly their appearance. And he makes a comment on the fact that these chimney sweepers look like Africans because they are black from head to toe, since they are inside the chimney the whole day, and they're cleaning the chimneys all the time. So they are covered in soot, and they do not belong to a class where they would have access to water or to cleaning and washing facilities, because they belong to the very poor, in fact the poorest section of society, because this is work that is ill paid, this is work that is dirty, this is work that no educated young boy would be asked to do. But the point where we left off was the point where Elia, in discussing his own life, had pointed to the fact that some of these young boys have such good manners and they are so polite in their behavior that it makes him think that perhaps they were not born poor, perhaps they are children who were abducted from their households and were brought up to work as laborers. And the fact that some of these young boys might come from very noble families, and he gives the example of Montague, he gives the example of Rachel from the Old Testament crying for her children, and says the fact that there are so many women who cry and who wait for children who were abducted or who were lost at a very small age, is evidence that those children are somewhere. And perhaps these boys are the same children who were abducted either at birth or soon after. So let us continue from where we left off and see what else Elia has to tell us about chimney sweepers, these young boys who set out in the very early hours of the morning to work. So Lamb says, in one of the state beds at Arundel Castle a few years since, under a ducal canopy, and you know Arundel Castle is that seat of the Howards, the clan, the family that goes back to Tudor times and even beyond. And this place, Arundel Castle, is known for the beautiful and the intricately carved and canopied beds which the Howards inhabited, and which is the family seat of the Howards. And encircled with curtains of delicatest crimson, with starry coronets interwoven, folded between a pair of sheets whiter and softer than the lap where Venus lulled Ascanius, was discovered by chance, after all methods of search had failed, at noonday, fast asleep, a lost chimney sweeper. Now, Lamb has been giving us many different ideas, and this time he brings in another idea, and this is that in one of the state rooms at Arundel Castle, what was discovered was a chimney sweeper who had gone to sleep in one of the state beds. A chimney sweeper in one of the state beds at Arundel Castle, the seat of the Howards? Yes, this is what Lamb says actually happened. Now, we don't know whether it happened or not, but just the very idea is something that strikes your imagination. Here is this beautiful bed which visitors come from far off to see, and they pay to see it. In this castle, which is the hereditary seat of the Howard family, and what is discovered is at noonday, probably when visitors were taking a round of the different staterooms, what they discovered is that in one of the beds there is a chimney sweeper fast asleep. Can you imagine this chimney sweeper who's black from head to toe, and these sheets that are soft and white and frothy, and the bed which is so soft that Lamb compares it to the lap of the goddess of beauty, the lap which lulled Adonai. And he says that in this bed that is soft and white and beautiful, you find a chimney sweep, a young chimney sweep, fast asleep. The little creature, having somehow confounded his passage among the intricacies of those lordly chimneys by some unknown aperture, had alighted upon this magnificent chamber, and, tired with his tedious explorations, was unable to resist the delicious invitement to repose which he there saw exhibited. So, creeping between the sheets very quietly, laid his black head upon the pillow and slept like a young Howard. What differentiates a Howard from a chimney sweep? That is the question that Lamb is asking here. And that's the question to which we have to find an answer. The difference is one of upbringing. A Howard is born in the family of the Howards, is raised as a Howard, spends time in education, spends time amongst other lads of his own class, and is known as a Howard. A chimney sweep, on the other hand, Lamb says he doesn't know where he was born. All he knows is he is being raised in a family of chimney sweepers. So, having given that earlier example of children being abducted as babies, Elia invites the reader to think of what would have happened if the baby who's abducted and who perhaps is brought up in a family of chimney sweepers had not been abducted. He might have been born in the Howard family, and if so, he would be brought up as a Howard. And having been brought up as a Howard, he would be entitled to all the luxuries of the world. So this chimney sweep, who perhaps got lost and who was tired and who saw this room, opened the door, saw this huge bed that nobody had used for years and years, and thought, why should I not sleep here? And so he climbed into the bed and fell fast asleep until he was woken up, and I'm sure he was probably jolted awake and said, What are you doing here? How dare you climb into this bed? And the only reason why these questions would be asked is because he is not brought up as a Howard, as the hereditary heir to the Howard clan. Such is the account given to the visitors at the castle. Of course, anything to increase the interest of the visitors who are lined up and who are being taken around by a tour guide and who are being shown all these beautiful objects inside Arundel Castle. But I cannot help seeming to perceive a confirmation of what I have just hinted at in this story. A high instinct was at work in the case, or I am mistaken. Is it probable that a poor child of that description, with whatever weariness he might be visited, would have ventured under such a penalty as he would be taught to expect, to uncover the sheets of a duke's bed and deliberately to lay himself down between them, when the rug or the carpet presented an obvious couch still far above his pretension? Is this probable, I would ask, if the great power of nature, which I contend for, had not been manifested within him, prompting to the adventure? Okay, so let's go back a bit. So Elias says, this is the story that is told to those people who visit Arundel Castle and who pay money to see what beautiful objects the Howards have gathered through the centuries and who have now displayed it for the common people, for anyone who can pay, let's say, £3 or £5 or £10 to take a tour of the place. So he says, what are the chances that this young boy was not actually a chimney sweep, but was perhaps a Howard who at some point had been abducted and had been brought up in a family of chimney sweeps? And the reason he gives, and Elia has method in his madness, the reason that Elia gives is that a chimney sweep does his job, he does his work, and the training that he gets includes very strict instructions on how he is to behave once he enters a building. There are very specific instructions that are given to him, and that's a part of his training. So one of the things that he will have been instructed on is how severely he would be punished if he were ever to sit on a sofa or a chair or a bed or try to use anything in that building. He would have received very strict instructions. And so, if you imagine for a moment that a chimney sweep enters a building, sees this room that is beautiful and luxuriously furnished, and he is tired and he wants to sleep, the instinct of the chimney sweep would be to lie down on the carpet or the rug and go to sleep there. A chimney sweep would not go and lie inside the bed. He would probably lie on the carpet or the rug. So it's, according to Elia, this is against the instincts of the chimney sweep. And that gives weight to his argument that not all these chimney sweeps were born in poor houses. Some of these chimney sweeps might have been born in a noble family, might have been born to a good family and been raised as a chimney sweep. And this story that is told to visitors by the tour guides, according to Elia, is evidence of his argument. So, doubtless the young nobleman, and he believes that this person who was found sleeping in the bed was a nobleman, was allured by some memory in the vague past, not amounting to full consciousness of his condition in infancy, when he was used to be lapped by his mother or his nurse in just such sheets as he there found, into which he was now but creeping back into his proper incunabula. Okay, now this is a tongue twister. Incunabula and resting place, by no other theory than by this sentiment of pre-existent state can I explain a deed so venturous, and indeed any other system so indecorous, in this tender but unseasonable sleeper. So, Elias says that this young man of the story probably was, if not a Howard, then he belonged to the nobility, and at birth or soon after was abducted and was raised to be a chimney sweep. And faced with this beautiful room, this luxuriously furnished room, some memory in his subconscious existed which told him that this bed was his rightful place of sleeping. Some memory in his subconscious prompted him to climb into this bed, because this is what he deserved. This was what he had been born to. So Elia is very firmly convinced that there can be no other explanation for the story of this young boy who is found sleeping in one of the state beds at Arundel Castle. So there's, as far as Elia is concerned, there can be no other explanation. My pleasant friend Jem White was so impressed with the belief of metamorphosis like this frequently taking place, that in some sort to reverse the wrongs of fortune in these poor changelings, he instituted an annual feast of chimney sweepers, at which it was his pleasure to officiate as host and waiter. It was a solemn supper held in Smithfield upon the yearly return of the fair of St. Bartholomew. Now, again a shift, and this time Elia says that one of his friends was so convinced of this theory of infants from noble families being brought up as chimney sweepers that he officiated at an annual feast that he held for chimney sweepers. And at this feast, he acted not only as host, he was also waiter. So he would serve these chimney sweepers because he was firmly convinced that these chimney sweepers were actually from very noble and aristocratic families. So he served as a host, and there was a particular time of the year that was reserved for this feast, and that was the yearly fair, the annual fair that was held in honor of St. Bartholomew. Cards were issued a week before to the master sweeps in and about the metropolis confining the invitation to their younger fry, so the older men were not invited. Now and then an elderly stripling would get in amongst us and be good-naturedly winked at, but our main body were infantry. One unfortunate wight indeed, who relying upon his dusky suit, had intruded himself into our party, but by tokens was providentially discovered in time to be no chimney sweeper, was chaoted out of the presence with universal indignation as not having on the wedding garment, but in general the greatest harmony prevailed. Now the idea that Elia is giving here of these chimney sweepers being members of the nobility is one that is supported by this friend of his called Jem White, who gives a supper every year in honor of these chimney sweepers, and he says that a week before this supper was held, and the occasion, which happens to be the annual fair of St. Bartholomew, he says invitation cards were issued. So this was a supper to which you had proper invitations sent out, and these invitations were sent out obviously to the master sweepers. And there were strict instructions that the master sweepers were only to send their younger fry, as he calls them, or the younger boys, the young chimney sweeps, not the elderly. But obviously it was the kind of occasion to which they looked forward, and news of this feast spread so far and wide that people wanted to gate crash. There were people who were not chimney sweeps but who still wanted to be part of that supper. So Elia, and now Elia describes himself as being one of the chimney sweeps, and he says that this occasion, which was reserved for us, there was this one time when a man intruded himself and wanted to be a part of the feast, but he was very soon discovered because they said that he was not properly dressed. Now you had to be in the guise of a chimney sweep in order to be invited to that supper. So if you were not dressed properly or you were not a chimney sweep, then obviously that feast was not for you. But in general, he says, the feast was conducted with the greatest harmony and everybody had a great time. The place chosen was a convenient spot among the pens at the north side of the fair, not so far distant as to be impervious to the agreeable hubbub of that vanity, but remote enough not to be obvious to the interruption of every gaping spectator in it. So the place chosen also was very close to where the fair was being held, but it wasn't so close that everyone who came to the fair could look in and could see what was happening. It was close enough so that, you know, in the background you had that music and the sounds of the fair, and these sounds and the music that that they could hear in the background gave the chimney sweeps the feeling that they were participating in the fair of St. Bartholomew, which they could not, because it took money to go to the fair. There were all these attractions and everything had to be paid for. So these young boys, they not only had good food to eat, but they also had musical accompaniment from the fair, and that made them feel that they were a part of the fair. The guests assembled about 7. So there was a format to this whole thing. 7 o'clock all the chimney sweepers would gather. In those little temporary parlors, 3 tables were spread with napery, not so fine as substantial, and at every board a comely hostess presided with her pan of hissing sausages. So hot food, and you can imagine in a climate like England's, where it is cold and wet throughout the year, you have hot food being served to you and being served by a beautiful waitress. So full protocol was given to these chimney sweepers. There was nothing that was missing from this feast that was being held. They were given comfortable places to sit at the table. It wasn't that they were made to sit on the floor and said, all right, here's the food and here's what you're going to eat today. So proper protocol, proper tables were laid, and the food that was served was not just well cooked and hot, but it was in sufficient quantity. You can imagine young boys who did not get 2 square meals a day perhaps, all of a sudden being invited to this feast. Obviously they would eat as much as they could hold, and you can't really blame them for it. The nostrils of the young rogues dilated at the savor, you know, all those smells of meat being cooked. James White, as head waiter, had charge of the first table, and myself, with our trusty companion by God, ordinarily ministered to the other 2. So there was one head waiter, and then there were these hostesses who looked after the needs and the requirements of the young chimney sweepers. There was clambering and jostling. Obviously you have young boys who've never had their stomachs full, and once a year they have this chance to eat as much as possible. So there was jostling, as he says, and there was clambering, and young men wanting to have food, and one coming from here, the other from there, and the other taking the plate away. So there was a lot of clambering and jostling as to who should get at the first table, because that was the table that was being served as by their host, James White. For Rochester in his maddest days could not have done the humours of the scene with more spirit than my friend. So not only was James White head waiter, but he put on a big act, and that combined to make these young boys feel very happy on this one occasion. After some general expression of thanks for the honor the company had done him, his inaugural ceremony was to clasp the greasy waist of old Dame Ursula, the fattest of these 3 hostesses, who stood frying and fretting, half blessing, half cursing the gentleman, and imprint upon her chaste lips a tender salute, whereat the universal host would set up a shout that tore the concave, while hundreds of grinning teeth startled the night with their brightness. So the host, James White, in an effort to make these young boys feel comfortable, would make a speech, and in this speech he would express his gratitude to the chimney sweepers for having accepted his invitation. So you see, here is this person who makes you feel so welcome. Not only is he providing a feast for these poor young boys, but he is actually thanking them for having accepted his invitation. You don't find many hosts like that. And so there was a lot of noise and a lot of feeling that here was a time for enjoyment. Oh, it was a pleasure to see the sable yonkers lick in the unctuous meat with his more unctuous sayings, how he would fit the tiny the tidbits to the puny mouths, reserving the lengthier links for the seniors, how he would intercept a morsel even in the jaws of some young desperado, declaring it must to the pan again to be browned, for it was not fit for a gentleman's eating. So this is the kind of atmosphere that prevailed inside this place where they're having this this feast. And you see that these hostesses who are frying sausages right there on the table, this was this was something that was beyond the imagination of these young boys, that they would have this feast and they would have fresh cooked food to eat. This was something that they could only imagine but not actually perceive, and on this one occasion they could actually eat fresh, hot, well-cooked food that is being served to them with all protocol. How he would recommend this slice of white bread or that piece of kissing crust to a tender juvenile, advising them all to have a care of cracking their teeth, which were their best patrimony. How gentilly he would deal about the small ale, as if it were wine, naming the brewer and protesting if it were not good, he should lose their custom with a special recommendation to wipe the lip before drinking. And then we had our toast. So James White, because he presided at the table, because he was the host, because he was the head waiter, made a big thing out of this feast, so that the young boys would not feel that there was anything that was missing from this feast. So he made a speech, he talked to them individually, he would recommend certain portions of the bread, he would recommend certain pieces of meat, and in all he would take a personal interest in making sure that all of the young boys sitting at his table were well fed and they were satisfied. And that was one reason why everyone wanted to sit at the first table, because they knew that James White himself would be serving there. And the other two tables that were served by Elia and by God, they weren't people who were as keen to go there, obviously, because they didn't have the same manner. So not only is James White providing this feast for them, but he's treating them as if they are VIPs, as if they are very prized guests, and he has to give them all protocol. So he'd tell them to be very careful of their teeth, because he believed that it was their beautiful white teeth which showed their noble ancestry, which showed that they belonged to the aristocracy, but due to some quirk of fate they had ended up as being very poor, in fact the very poorest in society. So this drink that he served them, he served it as if it were wine. And the young boys also were so excited and they were so happy at this occasion that they were being made to feel like grown-ups. They were being treated like young men. And so all the paraphernalia that surrounds a big feast was available to them, and all due protocol was given to these young guests. May the brush supersede the laurel. This was one of the toasts, you know, whenever Englishmen drink wine, they have a toast, and that toast is to the health of someone. It might be to the health of the queen or the king or whoever is present in that company. But this one toast that is specific to this particular feast is, may the brush supersede the laurel. Now, those of you who have studied classical literature will know that a branch of, or a twig of the laurel bush was used to crown victors in ancient Greece, and it was a sign of a victor. It was the ultimate, the ultimate in prizes that was conferred on victors. And the fact that James White proposes this toast, may the brush supersede the laurel, is reference to the fact that the chimney sweepers use a brush to clean the chimneys. And James White here is giving precedence to the brush, and he says that it is a higher honor than receiving the laurel. So all these and 50 other fancies, that is 50 other toasts, it could be anything, which were rather felt than comprehended by his guests, would he utter standing upon tables. So after the food is over, the tables are cleared, he would stand on the table and propose this toast and drink to the health of these young boys, etc., etc. So, and every sentence that he uttered would be prefixed with, "Gentlemen, give me leave." So the fact that he is referring to these young chimney sweepers as gentlemen is itself evidence of the respect that James White holds these chimney sweepers in, and he considers it an honor that he has been able to play host to them. Every now and then he would stuff something into a young boy's mouth, indiscriminate pieces, which pleased them mightily. So this camaraderie, this feeling of being at par with James White was what these young boys loved most of all, being treated not as servants, not as being from a lower class, but as being at par with the host. So this was something that gave them a wonderful feeling, and that this was the best part of the entertainment. Golden lads and lasses must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. James White is extinct, and with him these suppers have long ceased. He carried away with him half the fun of the world when he died, of my world at least. His old clients look for him among the pens, and missing him reproach the altered feast of St. Bartholomew and the glory of Smithfield, departed forever. Towards the end of the essay, Ilya becomes a little nostalgic, having discussed this feast of St. Bartholomew in great detail, and having discussed the chimney sweepers in great detail. He comes to mention of James White, and the two lines that he quotes are evidence of how much he misses this friend. He says that, as the poet said, golden lads and lasses must, as chimney sweepers, come to dust. Whether you're a nobleman or a king or a president or a chimney sweeper, all human beings must die. All human beings must one day become a part of this earth that gives birth to us, that nourishes and nurtures us. And so it was with James White. And Ilya becomes nostalgic and he says, James White is extinct, James White is no more, he died, and with him died the feast of the Chimney Sweeper, with him died the feast of Saint Bartholomew. According to Ilya, when James White died, he carried with him half the fun of the world. For the chimney sweepers of London, the world came to an end. Half the fun of the world died, half the fun of the world came to an end, because this was the one occasion to which they all look forward. And this occasion came to an end with James White. But then such is life. And since each one of us has to die one day, so it was with James White. The only difference being that when James White died, he brought to an end a tradition that he had started and that he had maintained for as long as he was alive. Now with that we come to the end of this essay, The Praise of Chimney Sweepers, and we're going to start the next, I will not call it an essay, since these are all listed under popular fallacies, and Lamb has written on different topics these very short and telling essays, and sometimes it's just 2 paragraphs. There are times when it is a long one. The one that we're going to be discussing in this class is a popular fallacy that a bully is always a coward. And what Lamb is doing in popular fallacies is taking up different areas, different aspects of life, and he's dealing with ideas that have been accepted and that have become a part of our lives, but which he is going to look at from a very different point of view than the one that is ordinarily taken. So the fallacy that a bully is always a coward is the one that he's going to explore in this essay. He starts off by saying this axiom contains a principle of compensation which disposes us to admit the truth of it. But there is no safe trusting to dictionaries and definitions. We should more willingly fall in with this popular language if we did not find brutality sometimes awkwardly coupled with valor in the same vocabulary. So one popular fallacy that a bully is always a coward is the one that he picks up here, and he says that this axiom has been used throughout our history, and we are assured that a person who bullies is actually a coward, and that when he is bullied, he will cow down. So Lamb is going to take up this popular fallacy and explore it to see how he can expose this fallacy for what it is. So he says that this axiom is based upon a principle of compensation, and the principle of compensation states that when a bully is bullied, he will back down, because a bully is always a coward. But he says that this is the dictionary meaning, and we should not trust dictionaries and, as he says, definitions, because they can be very misleading. The reason, he says, is that brutality in our world is very frequently synonymous with courage, with valor, and he's going to tell us in a bit what exactly he means. Okay, so here we go. The comic writers, with their poetical justice, have contributed not a little to mislead us upon this point. To see a hectoring fellow exposed and beaten upon the stage has something in it wonderfully diverting. Some people's share of animal spirits is notoriously low and defective. It has not strength to raise a vapor or furnish out the wind of a tolerable bluster. So he says writers have sort of tried to give examples, to give proof to support the popular fallacy that a bully is always a coward. But he says that in our world, since brutality is very often synonymous with courage, what happens is that if an individual gets up on the stage and starts to make long speeches about what we are doing wrong and how we should right the wrongs that we have done, and somebody else gets up and starts beating him up, the person who is beating that hectoring fellow is going to be admired. People are going to say, oh yes, wonderful, clap for him, applaud him. That, Elias says, is not to be done, because these loved to be told that huffing is no part of valor. The truest courage with them is that which is the least noisy and obtrusive. Now, what we are told is that the brave, the courageous, do not make a lot of noise. Empty vessels make the most noise. That's what we've been taught, and that if you have courage, you do not need to make a big show out of it. But Elias says that again is a fallacy in this world, unless you make your own place. Nobody is going to give you a place. Unless you make people believe that you are important, no one is going to give you important. The truest courage with them is that which is the least noisy and obtrusive. This is what we are taught. But confront one of these silent heroes with the swaggerer of real life, and his confidence in the theory quickly vanishes. Pretensions do not uniformly bespeak non-performance. Okay, so what he's saying here is that we are told that we must be brave and courageous and not show off. So we must be courageous and we must be silent. But what happens is that these so-called brave and courageous people, when they are faced with an individual who imposes his ideas, his point of view on them, these brave and so-called courageous people at once back down and accept whatever the bully is saying. So it's a fallacy that a bully is always a coward. The bully here is proving to be stronger than the so-called courageous person who is who may be brave but who is also silent. So pretensions do not uniformly bespeak non-performance. A modest, inoffensive deportment does not necessarily imply valor. So just as bullies are not cowards, so also does Ilya says those who are silent are not necessarily courageous. They're not necessarily brave or valorous. Neither does the absence of it justify us in denying that quality. Hickman wanted modesty. We do not mean him of Clarissa, but whoever doubted his courage. Even the poets upon whom this equitable distribution of qualities should be most binding have thought it agreeable to nature to depart from the rule upon occasion. So he says that just as a bully is not always a coward, a man who is quiet and who doesn't speak does not necessarily have to be courageous or valorous or brave. And this is a fact that, according to Elia, poets and writers have also recognized, and therefore when they make or they construct their heroes, they make sure that those heroes also make speeches. So in the tradition of the Greek classics, if you have a warrior coming out into the field and making a speech before he attacks his enemy, that doesn't mean that he does not have courage or that he is not brave, but that is how he is presenting himself. He has to convince his opponent, his enemy, that he has a worthy person who is going to combat him. So he says that poets and writers are also very careful, and when they make heroes, they make sure that the heroes realize the role that they have to play, and they prepare for it accordingly. Harafa in the Agonistes is indeed a bully upon the received notions. Milton has made him at once a blusterer, a giant, and a dastard. But Almanzo in Dryden talks of driving armies singly before him, and does it. Tom Brown had a shrewder insight into this kind of character than either of his predecessors, but we'll deal with Tom Brown in a bit. So he talks about Harafa in Samson Agonistes, and he says that Milton made Harafa into a bully who backed down. He was a man who made a long speech and yet did not have the strength or the courage or valor to pursue with the claims that he was making of bravery. And then he gives another example, and he says, on the other hand, when Dryden writes about Almanzo, he makes his character deliver a speech in which he claims that he will drive armies before him. Single-handedly he will combat them. And he does it. So it is up to the poet or the writer to present his characters in a way that they become believable. And so Almanzo in Dryden's play is not a bully. He is a hero, and whatever he states, whatever he claims, he lives up to it. Whereas in Samson Agonistes, Milton presents Harafa as a person who just makes a long speech and then cannot follow up on it, does not have the bravery or the strength to support the claims that he has made. So Tom Brown divides the power more equably and allows his hero a sort of immediate preeminence. And then he gives another example, and he says that Tom Brown has presented this one character who is called Bully Dawson, and he has presented him in a way that it becomes more easily believable. And the sentence that he uses is, Bully Dawson kicked by half the town, and half the town kicked by Bully Dawson. This was true distributive justice. So let's go back to the previous slide, where he's making a comparison of Milton's Harafa and Dryden's Almanzo. And then the third example that he gives is of Tom Brown, and he says that in Tom Brown's example, there is such a good instance of how justice can be maintained, of how equality can be maintained, that it's a sentence that is worth quoting, because the character that he's describing is called Bully Dawson, and he's called Bully Dawson because he's a bully. But Tom Brown also makes sure that he gives just sufficient courage and valor to Bully Dawson and the townsfolk, so that the situation is one in which the balance is maintained. Bully Dawson bullies half the town and is in turn bullied by the rest of the town, so that if he is keeping half the town under his influence, he in turn is influenced by the rest of the town. And by doing that, Tom Brown has made sure that the balance is maintained. Now, as we come to the end of this popular fallacy, let me quickly go through what we have done in this lecture today. This part was from the popular fallacies. Prior to this, what we were discussing was the remainder of the essay titled The Praise of the Chimney Sweepers, where Lamb, in the guise of Elia, discusses and describes in great detail these young boys who work as chimney sweeps and who leave their houses early in the morning and go and clean the chimneys of the houses in London. And Lamb gives a detailed description of these chimney sweeps, and he says that one of the chimney sweeps was found fast asleep in the state bed in Arundel Castle, and he takes that example, which is actually a story that is told by the tour guides. He takes that example and he bases an argument upon it, and the argument is that not all these chimney sweeps are born poor. Some of them have been born in noble families, have been born in good families, but are abducted at a very small age, perhaps as infants, perhaps as toddlers, and then they are brought up by men who want them to work as chimney sweeps, and they're not told about their true ancestry, they're not told about their heritage. And so he says that this young chimney sweep who comes and he goes to sleep in the state bed, there is reason to believe that he came from a noble family, because if he had not, then even if he were feeling sleepy and he were lost inside Arundel Castle, he could just have gone to sleep on the carpet, because even the carpet is softer and more luxurious than the place that he sleeps in at home. So based upon that, he takes this argument further, and he describes the feast that his friend James White used to hold every year side by side with the fair of St. Bartholomew, and he says that at this feast he would invite all the young chimney sweepers, the boys, not the elderly men, not the mature adults, but only the young boys, and he would treat them like VIPs. He would treat them like gentlemen, not only by serving hot food, but by making sure that they were treated as gentlemen, not as people who were being given a free meal. This was a feast, and it was prepared as a feast. There were these 3 tables that were laid out, and at each table there would be these beautiful women who would cook the food fresh for these young boys. And not only were these women there to serve their needs, but James White, along with Elia and one of their other friends by God, would make sure that they presided at these tables, and not only did they give them the fresh food, but they also made sure that choice bits were given out to them. It wasn't just like, throwing food at these young boys, but they were served very properly, seated at the table, and just the way that they would have been served had they been in their proper place, had they been in those noble families or in those aristocratic households where they were born and from where they were taken away when they were very small. So he gives a lot of detail regarding the feast, and he ends on a rather nostalgic note, because he says that James White is dead, and with the death of James White, this feast of St. Bartholomew, which paralleled the fair of St. Bartholomew, this came to an end. And perhaps no one felt the absence of James White as strongly as these young chimney sweepers of London. That is about the gist of the essay. And then, of course, we went on to one of the popular fallacies, and that is that a bully is always a coward. And in popular fallacies, what Lamb is doing is he's taking one axiom after another and trying to expose it, trying to explore it. And with the help of examples, he proves that a bully does not always have to be a coward. A person who tries to intimidate, or who tries to impress his bravery and courage on his listeners, may have the courage and may have that actual strength to do what he claims to. And he gives examples from literature. He gives the example of Milton's Samson Agonistes, and he says that the character that Milton creates does not live up to his claims, but the character that Dryden claims in Almanzo, that's a character that is created and who lives up to his claims of driving an army before him. And then he concludes by giving an example from Tom Brown, where he says Tom Brown balances when he uses that one sentence that Bully Dawson kicked half the town, and half the town kicked Bully Dawson. So he sort of maintains that balance. That's enough for today. You've been very patient. Thank you very much for your patience, and Allah Hafiz.